Hello, and welcome to the Faith to You podcast. Have you ever heard the phrase, he's so heavenly minded that he's no earthly good? You know, there's a misunderstanding, I think, oftentimes in our culture where people look at Christians or committed believers and they think, you know what, you're not going to be able to do anything in this life because you're thinking too much about the next. But actually, the opposite is true. You see, goodness isn't defined based on the things of earth. Only God is good, and only those who have their hearts fixed on eternity will be able to create any earthly good. And so actually, if you're not heavenly minded, you can't do anything on earth that is good. Several weeks ago, I was preaching on John 17:11 through 19, and I talked about what it means to be in the world, but not of the world. And what I want to do today is I want to go a little bit more in depth into that topic. Since I preached on that, I've had some people ask me some questions, and so I want to address it a little bit further. In that sermon, I went to 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. Let me read that to you. Do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For everything in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride in one's possessions is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world with its lust is passing away, but the one who does the will of God remains forever. Do you know what Eve's problem was? Think about for a second what it was that Satan used to tempt Eve when she gave in to eating that fruit. If you go through their conversation, what you'll see it was exactly what John talks about in 1 John chapter 2. It was the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride in one's possessions. What Satan does when he tempts us to get distracted from the goodness that God has given to us is the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride in one's possessions. The way that we are to live as new creations is to not be attached to these things that are passing away. And that's what it says in verse 17. The world with its lust is passing away, but the one who does the will of God remains forever. What it means to be in the world but not of the world, it means to not love the world or the things in the world. And the way we do that is what it says right here in verse 17, by recognizing the temporary state of the things on earth. Everything upon earth is going to pass away, but he who does the will of God remains forever. If you're going to be in this world but not of it, your focus, your primary objective needs to be what is the will of God. Now, to comprehend that, you need to think with the mind of Christ. And guess what? As new creations, that's what you have. You have the mind of Christ. That's why Paul says this in Romans 12:2. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so you may discern what is the good, pleasing, and perfect will of God. So instead of being controlled by the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, instead you focus your mind on what is good, pleasing, and the perfect will of God. This is the question that you're asking as you go through your life. As you decide what you're going to do, what you're going to focus on, how you're going to live, you ask yourself what's good, what's pleasing, and what's the perfect will of God. What this means is you need to stop thinking like the world. And that's what he's talking about right here when he says, don't be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. When he says don't be conformed to this age, he's saying don't think like the people that surround you. Don't be conformed to the culture that you find yourself in. And now I want you to think about what that means for a second, because usually when we try to transcend culture, we do that by looking at the things about the culture that surrounds us that we least like. And we try to be as little like that as possible. And there's a problem there. And here's why. It's because culture is deceptive. The culture you're most tempted to conform to is not the one that looks least like you. I want you to think about this for a second. Usually when people are trying to be transformed, they look at people who politically are different from them. Socioeconomically, they're different from them. Their views about what they should value is different from them. They look at those people who are far away and they say, I'm not going to be like those people. But the culture that you're most tempted to conform to is the one that surrounds you. As a matter of fact, I think that the most deceptive culture for us as Christians is cultural Christianity. And so oftentimes we can act like we're different from the world because we're around a lot of like-minded people. But being transformed by the renewing of the mind doesn't mean that you're with a bunch of like-minded people. It means you have the mind of Christ. And so I want you to think for a minute, what does it mean to not be conformed to cultural Christianity? And what that means is that your faith is your own. You're living the way you're living because you value the things of heaven more than the things of earth. Not because the people around you do, but because you do. Heaven is your destiny. That's your focus. That's what you're living for. You're not living for the things that are passing away. It's really easy for us to be fake Christians, to sort of live for the same things that the people around us are living for, and then they value us and we derive value from that because we are looking at the same things that they are. We're doing the same things that they are, and it's really easy for us to feel good about that. That's not what we're talking about. What it means to be in this world but not of this world means that you're not conformed at all to the culture that surrounds you, even if that's a cultural Christianity. In early Germany, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was looking at the people who surrounded him, and he coined this term that I think is extremely relevant even today. He called it cheap grace, which is the idea that Jesus saves me and so I can live however I want. And that's not what we are saved for. Instead, he says we're saved for costly discipleship. And what that means is we're saved to be sold out for Jesus. No matter what the world throws at us, our highest value, the thing that we're going to hold on to the most, is Jesus Christ and living for him. And what you need to understand is that there's going to oftentimes be places in your life where those two things are going to come at odds with each other, where the goal to live for Jesus and the goal to be accepted by the world are going to be at odds. And you're going to have to make a decision. You're going to have to make a choice whether you're going to live for Jesus or you're going to live for the world. And really the only way you can be confident you're going to be making the right choices if you're transforming your thoughts. He says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So we need to have a transformed mind. And so that brings me to the next question I want to ask. How do we do that? How do we have a transformed mind? And what that really means, it means to think the thoughts of Christ with the mind of Christ. Now that sounds maybe preposterous unless you understand this. As a new creation, you're indwelt by the Spirit. And the Spirit takes the things of God's Word and applies them to your heart. But this is a process. This is something that you have to exercise. For years, I was a math teacher. And as I would teach math, I would teach my students a way of thinking. Oftentimes students would come into my classroom and they would think that mathematics was all about learning a bunch of formulas, memorizing those formulas, and then regurgitating upon command. And that's not what math is. The word math literally means to learn. I was teaching them how to think, to learn. And what it means to renew our minds, it means to learn how to think like Christ, to look at the things that surround us and think biblically about them, to discern God's will as we're going through this life. Hebrews 5 says it this way. In Hebrews 5:13, it says, now everyone who lives on milk is inexperienced with the message about righteousness because he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, for those whose senses have been trained to distinguish between good and evil. What I want you to understand is you need to be eating meat. And the writer of Hebrews is saying, you guys have been Christians for a long time. You should be at the point now where you can eat meat. And I want you to understand this. To eat meat, you have to be weaned off of milk. And that means you need to not be satisfied with simply having something that somebody else has done all the work to comprehend, and then they set it in front of you. And instead, you go to the text yourself, you wrestle through it, and you try to learn what is it that this says, what did it say to the people it was written to, and how does that apply to me today? And you wrestle through that on your own. You don't just listen to preachers on podcasts and on the radio, but you actually go into the text yourself in the Spirit and you're reading it. Every single Christian should get to that point. If a baby tries to drink milk at a certain point, we're going to say, no, this isn't good anymore. You need to be growing up. You need to be weaned off of this. It's the same for every single believer. And what happens is their senses are exercised to distinguish between good and evil. As you learn to stretch yourself, you'll begin to discern, oh, this is wrong. This is right. This is what God would have me to do. This is what he would have me to resist. And now you're owning your faith. Now you're not just a cultural Christian just going along with the flow, but you actually know why you're doing what you're doing, and you're doing it for the right reason. What it looks like to live in a culture that's opposed to Christianity, it looks like Moses in the middle of Egypt. Now, I want you to think about Moses for a second, because Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace. He grew up with Egyptian values. He was the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter. But he chose to reject that lifestyle. Everything about his culture, he chose to walk away from it. I want you to understand this. When he chose that, he was choosing suffering. He was choosing to be an outcast. Hebrews 11 says this about Moses. Hebrews 11:24, by faith Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter and chose to suffer with the people of God rather to enjoy the fleeting pleasure of sin. For he considered reproach for the sake of Christ to be greater wealth than the treasures of Egypt, since he was looking ahead to the reward. By faith he left Egypt behind, not being afraid of the king's anger. For Moses persevered as one who sees him who is invisible. Are you persevering as one who sees him who is invisible? Are you looking to the invisible God for your value, for your identity? Are you willing to choose suffering? Do you see that's what Moses did? He chose suffering. Why? Because he considered being reproached for the sake of Christ greater treasure than all the treasure in Egypt. I want you to think about that for a second. The most powerful nation in the world he had at his fingertips. He could have had anything he wanted, and he rejected that. Why? Because he saw being insulted for Jesus as worth more than all the treasure upon the earth. That's what it means to be in the world, but not of the world. It means that you accept suffering for Christ as a higher value than anything that this life can give you. I hope that you're learning to not be conformed to this world, but to be transformed. Don't love the world. Don't think like the world. Instead, look to him who's invisible. Thank you so much for listening today.